in this module of the NCI Level 1 certification, we're going to discuss the influence of stress and sleep on metabolism and body composition. So just to provide an overview of this module, first lesson we're going to talk about the fundamentals of stress, some of the basics. And then the second lesson we'll look at cortisol facts and myths, since cortisol seems to be the buzzword that kind of reached the masses and just kind of got used and abused and transformed into all kinds of false things. And with lesson 3, we'll look at the relationship between stress and eating behavior. And the final lesson, we'll look at the relationship between stress, sleep, eating behavior, and how it affects body composition. So with that, let's get started on lesson 1, which is the fundamentals of stress. And we can begin by talking about the guys who started the science of it. So the pioneers of stress research, an unsung hero in this regard, is a gentleman named Walter Bradford Cannon. He lived from 1871 to 1945, and he was a professor and chairman of the Department of Physiology at Harvard Medical School. Now, he deserves credit for some of the earliest known scientific research that generated the initial concepts of the human stress response. He gets credit for coming up with the term fight or flight, and he also came up with the term homeostasis. So everybody thinks of Hans Selye when we think of pioneers of stress science, but Walter Bradford Cannon doesn't get nearly enough credit. After Walter Bradford Cannon, like I mentioned, a few years down in history, we've got Hans Selye. He lived from 1907 to 1982, and he was an endocrinologist, and he's actually credited as being the first person to discuss and define stress from a biological point of view. So he actually defined stress as a non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it. And as we'll see, our understanding of stress and the body's stress response evolved from that rather rudimentary definition. So Hans Selye is credited with originating the concept of general adaptation syndrome. And the general adaptation syndrome has 3 stages. So the first stage is the alarm phase, which is characterized by acute manifestations of absorbing the stress. And then the resistance phase, which is characterized by these acute manifestations somewhat dissipating and disappearing. And then finally, if you get that far in the general adaptation syndrome cycle, the final stage is the exhaustion phase. So this is when the first stage reaction may be recapitulated, or it may result in the collapse of the organism. So the exhaustion phase, if you think about, we'll take an example like training. So the alarm phase is sort of the initial absorption of the stimuli of training. The resistance phase is where slower and gradual developments and adaptations take place. And if you overtrain, then you reach the exhaustion phase, which can manifest in adverse outcomes. So Hans Selye is responsible for the concept of the general adaptation syndrome, and it's used in many different facets of human physiology. So a related concept is the SAID principle. The person who gets credit for this is Franklin M. Henry, who published the concepts of the SAID principle in 1958. SAID stands for Specific Adaptation to Imposed Demand. Now, the clever guy who actually coined that particular acronym, nobody knows who it is. But Frederick Henry gets credit for presenting the concepts of the SAID principle within the context of human physiology and exercise specifically. All right, let's talk about our evolving understanding of the stress system. As you see in the diagram, big time credit to Liu and colleagues. That's where you're seeing this graphic from. If you take a look at the basic understanding of the stress system, this is sort of our initial understanding of the stress system, which consisted of a stimulus, which affects a stressor, which creates the stress, which creates the stress response and results in some effect. So let's define each of these terms. So stimulus is whatever activity or whatever is initiated that creates the stressor. So I'll give you an example. So in framework A, which is the basic framework, we can look at the stimulus as, let's say, smoking or excessive drinking. And we're ultimately going to use the example of oxidative stress. So the stimulus would be, let's just use excessive smoking. And the stressor would be the creation of reactive oxygen species, or what the lay public has heard of as free radicals. So the creation of excess free radical activity leads to the stress, which we can call oxidative stress. And then that would lead to the body's stress response, which would include things like ramping up antioxidant activity in order to quench these free radicals. And then finally, the effect would be either in the favorable direction or in some sort of adverse direction, depending on how successful the stress response was. So this was the old model, which was stimulus, stressor, stress response, and effect. So this actually evolved with the developing framework B, where we include the concept of homeostasis. So you can think of homeostasis as the internal milieu of the body that is, under normal healthy conditions, maintained relatively constant. So there is an internal equilibrium physiologically that your body maintains in spite of changes that are going on externally in the environment that may be challenging the internal equilibrium. So that constant state of internal equilibrium is called homeostasis. So with this second developing framework here, we can look at a stimulus once again, let's say smoking. And then the stressor would be the generation of reactive oxygen species or free radicals. And if there is no challenge to homeostasis or that internal equilibrium of the body, then we can say that, well, there's no stress. Now, if homeostasis is challenged or disrupted, then we can define that as stress. Okay, so now we've got oxidative stress in this particular example. And so this would lead to the stress response, which once again, the body generates antioxidant activity to combat this oxidative stress. And then we have the effect, which could either be the manifestation of disease, or it can just be the body attempting to recover and fend off disease. So this particular framework actually evolved even further to include the terms sus-stress and distress. Okay, so with the concept of stress, we have certain terms. Sus-stress or under-stress, that's a lack of homeostatic challenge. And that can actually result in a decreased buffering or defensive capacity, if you will, against challenges to homeostasis. So it sort of can weaken the organism if there's not enough stress. Okay, so that is a concept called sus-stress. A mnemonic device to remember that if there's not enough activity, not enough challenge, then well, that's kind of sus. That is one mnemonic device which is actually inspired by my grown children. So eustress is what we can consider to be good stress or productive stress. So that represents a moderate challenge to homeostasis, resulting in increased defensive capacity and favorable adaptations over time. Probably the most salient example would be training and the development of either cardiorespiratory fitness or musculoskeletal fitness, or both. And that is an example of eustress. And then finally, we've got distress, which is bad stress. And we can define that as strongly challenged homeostasis instead of moderately challenged homeostasis. So a disruption or an overly strong challenge to homeostasis that can result in a severe stress response, which ultimately can impair homeostasis and result in damage and disease. So that's distress. So that is the continuum. Sus-stress, not enough stress. Eustress, which is moderate or good stress. And then finally, distress, which is too much stress or too strong of a set of stressors. All right, so that forms the modern or contemporary framework of how we understand stress. So you can see on the right quite a clever diagram by Liu and colleagues. And I realize that this particular slide is pretty busy, so you may need to go over it, go over the definitions in order for stuff to sink in. I am going to burden everyone with a simplified, very simplified overview of the physiology of the stress response. And when we talk about stress, we have to talk about the nervous system, because that is sort of the basis from which our body handles stress. So the nervous system has two major branches. So you've got the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord. And then you've got the peripheral nervous system, which is essentially everything else. And there are sub-branches of the peripheral nervous system, which are the autonomic nervous system, which is essentially an involuntary system of actions there. And then the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. So the somatic system is largely within our control. That consists of things like the musculoskeletal system and sensing things through skin. And autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, that is involuntary, that's out of our control, out of our conscious control. And that is further subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system, which largely governs the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system. So these two branches are under the autonomic nervous system once again, which is involuntary. And the fight or flight response under the sympathetic nervous system, now you can divide this into a couple of sub-branches yet. And this is where we kind of focus in, and this is where the bulk of the stress response gets discussed when we look at the so-called sympathetic adrenal medullary axis, or the SAM, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA. The main difference between the SAM and the HPA is that the SAM is synaptically driven, which implies a quick and temporary response to stress. Okay, so your body under the SAM system, that would control things like heart rate and blood pressure, and that would largely govern what happens with your fight or flight instantaneous decisions. Now, on the other hand, the HPA axis is a slower and more protracted response to stress. So that involves more metabolic and hormonal responses. And so that is a slower acting type of response system. But they both work simultaneously. It's just that the SAM happens quickly and the HPA acts in a lot more protracted fashion. The SAM works to ultimately produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And the HPA, its final product, is cortisol, or cortisol is the main glucocorticoid. Now this is, once again, it's a very simplified view of how the nervous system works and how the body deals with stress. And I'm going to lead to a discussion about cortisol, which will be in the next lesson. Now, but before I move on to that, I just want to mention that under the autonomic nervous system, you have the sympathetic nervous system, which involved these subsystems that we talked about, the SAM and the HPA. But I also have to mention the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the body's sort of rest and digest type of system, or what I've heard people call the feed and breed system. So that helps the organism recover from stress, help the organism relax. And so this is kind of the other part of the cycle. So all of these sub-branches of the peripheral nervous system, they all have a constant crosstalk with the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And so everything works together, everything intercommunicates, everything integrates. And so this is one of those busy slides that you're going to want to kind of go over to just let it sink in if this is one of your first exposures to this, or if you haven't discussed or been taught any of this stuff for years and decades. And I will move on to lesson 2, where we'll talk about the myths and facts about the final product of the HPA axis, which is coil.